Cool. So we're now recording. To those who are here and those who are listening to this later, welcome to the latest Hack From Home talk. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Hector Page of Privitar, speaking about privacy. We've had a really exciting series of events on the speaker stage through today, and there's been experts on privacy, of which this is the second. We've had lecturers from Korea telling us about the privacy implications and the perceptions of contact tracing in Korean society. We've had insights on public health and epidemiology from Professor of Case West University. And we've had the Open Data Institute's Ethics Canvas and more besides, with, of course, more to come tomorrow. After this talk, we'll be having a further lecture on some neurological related innovations. And then we will be having the, what personally excites me very much, the happy hour, which is going to be an interesting logistical challenge given the number of time zones we're in. So without further ado, I will cede the floor to Hector to speak about differential privacy.
Thank you very much. So I will just share my screen for starters. So hope everyone can see that all right. So yes, I've been invited to come along to the hackathon and talk about differential privacy and let you know what some of the noise is all about. Excuse me. So for starters, I think it's sensible to explain what do I mean by privacy, because differential privacy is valid in particular settings, and not all notions of privacy are helped by differential privacy. So I'm thinking of a situation where you have some data, you perform some analysis, and you get some output from that. And typically people tend to think about privacy being about row-level data about specific individuals. But even when you're performing an analysis of a data set containing individuals that then extracts perhaps some group insights about groups of people, that can actually still reveal information about individual people. So it is still risky. A way to do this, a goal of privacy in this particular setting, would be to perform some modified version of this analysis to produce some safer outputs. Typically, there's a trade-off here. There's no such thing as a free lunch, of course. And in this case, the trade-off is with the usefulness of your analysis, the accuracy of your analysis. So typically, the modification makes it less easy to learn things about original people in the data set from aggregates about groups. But it also makes your aggregates slightly less accurate. So what we're doing here is performing a complex and difficult balancing act. So what are these risks I talk about? Perhaps you're not buying into this yet. So the main one that we tend to think of is what's called reconstruction. So bear with me as I explain it, but imagine you are releasing analysis to a notional adversary who's pictured here on the screen. And before you've released any analysis, they have no idea the sort of possible data set you could be holding, as indicated here on their screen. But as soon as you release a piece of analysis, what this does is it narrows down the universe of possible data sets that this analysis could have come from, right? So there's only so many data sets that could have produced this exact set of, for example, summary statistics. And as you do this more and more, the adversary's notion, the attacker's notion of what your data set is becomes narrower and narrower. So they, like a Sudoku puzzle, hone in on the solution. And eventually, it's possible to learn with, rather a startling degree of accuracy, the original data set. And this is what we call a reconstruction attack. So you take the clues, the analysis you've published, and the adversary can reconstruct your original data set. And this is important in the context, obviously, of things like COVID-19, because you can perform an analysis and you think you're releasing it publicly and there's no risk in it. But in fact, a clever adversary, a technically sophisticated adversary, would be able to reverse this process of data to analysis and go back to the original data again, and thereby learn a great deal about specific individuals, which of course impacts on their right to privacy. So this is why we want differential privacy in this tool. In this setting rather, it's a tool to prevent things like reconstruction attacks. It sounds a bit theoretical and abstract, but it's actually deadly serious and a concrete threat. So here's a tweetorial from John Aboud, the chief methodologist of the US Census Bureau, and he's just telling the world that his internal experiments at the Census Bureau were able to reconstruct 100% of the records in the census microdata from the aggregates that we release. So this could allow an adversary potentially to infer a given individual's ethnicity or sexuality or things of this sense that they'd rather perhaps keep to themselves, and perhaps they think, if they're replying to the census truthfully, that the census has a right, in fact, by law, I believe, to keep these things confidential. And in fact, this is no longer the case with attacks such as reconstruction. So there's two things you can do about this. I like to think of two ways to prevent these kinds of attacks. So one is you can focus on having a safe environment. And by environment, I mean everything to do with the data that isn't actually the data itself. So things like who you release it to, and what you think those people are capable of doing, and what other data they might have that might help their attack. So you can think of the environment as the factors not to do with the data that limit the motivation and opportunity of a would-be attacker. So you can prevent attacks from an environment. Perhaps you can keep your data locked down and distribute it only to trusted individuals. Only particular people see your analysis. This might not always be possible. It might not always be desirable for some sorts of analysis. The other thing you can do on the other side of it is you can make your data safer. So you can modify your data, and this is what I was talking about on the first slide. You can modify your data to be a bit safer. You can modify your analysis to be a bit safer, rather, I should say. And that prevents these kinds of attacks at the level of the data. So there's two approaches, and differential privacy is about safe data and safe analysis. So to give a sort of slightly more topical and concrete example, say we're constructing some count tables of how many people have a diagnosis positive in particular age groups, broken down by age here on the left and age and gender here on the right. A classic tool, statistical agencies such as the ONS in the UK or the Census Bureau in the US, a classic tool they'll use is to suppress points where there's a 1, so or less than, say, 3 or 2. So they'll suppress small counts because that's easier to learn about individuals. But in this case, we can actually learn one of these small counts. We can learn something rather specific about an individual person from these released. Maybe the beady-eyed amongst you will have already been able to spot it. I'd be very impressed if you would, actually. But in the 40 to 49 age band, we have 28 people. Excuse me. If we look in our age and gender table down here on the right, we see that 27 of them have been accounted for. We also know that there must be 6 people with a positive diagnosis here for COVID-19. And here we see that only 5 of them have been accounted for. So in fact, by a little bit of logic, not a great leap to be frank, we've worked out that there is a person, 40 to 49, male, who has a diagnosis positive. So it's a little bit of a constructed example from me, but it's supposed to illustrate to you the fact that even though you're releasing statistics about groups of people, it's possible to use these statistics to get at individual people. And this is precisely the sort of thing that differential privacy is trying to prevent. So talk about why we have it and the context we use it in. What exactly is it? So it's got a funny definition, which I'll walk you through. But by and large, differential privacy relies on adding noise to an analysis. And doing so allows you to make certain statements. They're actually mathematical statements, and that is differential privacy. It is the mathematical statement. It's a property of an analysis rather than the method of doing the analysis itself. And in fact, you can have differentially private versions of many types of analysis. They all just have to have this property to be differentially private. So what you do is you add noise to your analysis. So say we're doing an analysis about a data set that contains businessman Bob here. You release your analysis with some noise and you get an answer, a noisy answer. So this noise is probabilistic noise drawn from a distribution, typically a Laplace distribution. Yeah, so you get a noisy answer here. Hypothetically speaking, were you to perform this analysis on exactly the same data set without Bob in and add noise in the same way using Laplace random variable, you would get another noisy answer. Differential privacy at its heart says that the difference between these two answers is always provably bounded. So between your real situation with Bob and a hypothetical situation where Bob was not in the data, the answer wouldn't be very, very different. You can think of it in a few ways. I like to think of it as adding the noise obscures the effect of individual people without obscuring the effect of groups of people. That's one intuitive way to think of it. So why do we care about this hypothetical scenario when we're not going to do it? What's the point of this statement? Why do we want this differentially private statement, this differential between our real and hypothetical situation? Well, the point is, as I said, adding noise creates uncertainty. So you don't know whether you wouldn't know between these two situations, the real and the hypothetical, whether the answer was different due to Bob's presence or absence, or due to the noise you added. And in fact, DP is the mathematical statement that the amount the answer could differ is limited. Now, this is important back in the real domain instead of thinking about hypothetical differences between analyses, because it means that the answer doesn't depend particularly on Bob. Just logically, if the answer doesn't change very much, the answer no longer really depends on whether Bob is in the data or not. And what that in turn means is it reveals a minimal amount of information that is specific to Bob. There's a limited amount you can learn specifically to Bob from the result of this analysis that comes from adding this noise. So that's why we tend to think about this difference between a real and hypothetical scenario. And this differentially private guarantee, which is that the amount the answer could differ between these scenarios is limited and therefore reveals a specific amount about Bob. This differential privacy guarantee extends to any given person in this data set. So all people who are all your data subjects, so you do an analysis, you publish some statistics, and they're differentially private because you've added noise in the right way. It depends in a limited way on each of those people. So there's a limited amount you can learn about any given individual. And differential privacy bounds that. It produces an upper bound. It says you cannot learn more than this amount about a specific individual. So the key thing about using it in practice, what you really need to know is how much noise do I add? Where do we set the dial here? So on the left-hand side, you say you don't add any noise. Well, you're revealing quite a lot of information about individuals, as much as the analysis would anyway. So that's the most risk, but it's also the most useful analysis you can do, right? There's no noise added to your statistics. They are just the truth, or the truth as close as you're able to collect the data for, I suppose. But as you crank the dial up, you're adding more noise and you're leaking less information. So you're revealing less about specific people. And therefore there's less risk. So the most noise you could have would be least risk. But then you're also making your analysis noisier. So intuitively, you're making it less useful. You're obscuring some effects you might want to see. And this is at the heart of how to use differential privacy, is where do you set that dial? And that's a difficult question that should involve a broad array of stakeholders, I think. So technically how to do it, of course, but ethically, what does a certain organization think is the right amount to reveal about people? Sounds a bit difficult, technical, mathematical, bit abstract in some cases, but there are very concrete benefits for this situation. So I've already mentioned that it's a tool to prevent attacks such as reconstruction. In fact, it's the only tool I'm aware of that will definitely do this. So there's a provable guarantee, which means it's quite trustworthy and reliable. So the DP guarantee about there's limited difference between the true and the hypothetical scenario is provable. It's mathematically provable. So it is just simply a statement. It is a property of the analysis it has. We have a single parameter, we call it epsilon, and that basically controls the amount of noise you add, which means that you have an explicit control on the balance between individual privacy and the utility of your analysis. So you get to choose where to set your dial. It also has a really handy property I like called composition. So what this means is that if you do many differentially private analyses, you can reason about the overall level of differential privacy you get across them all. And this is really handy if you're doing a lot of analyses or building complex analyses that are built from smaller differentially private components. Really important in the current climate is that there's no secrecy required. So actually the privacy guarantee you get, the differentially private guarantee, does not depend on keeping what you've done to the data secret. This is really important in two ways. So firstly, it's really great for public trust. You can say to data subjects, this analysis guarantees that we're going to reveal a limited amount about you, small amount about you, but perhaps not enough for an attack. And here's how we do it. And you can be open source, you can put your code base up online, as the US Census has done, in fact, and be straightforward with everyone and upfront with everyone. And that's really important if, for example, you require opt-in for your data gathering in the first place. If you can say to people, look, you can audit what we're doing, you can see what we're doing, we're completely straightforward and open here. That's a great source of confidence, I think, to data subjects about whether or not they want to contribute their data to your system. but equally important for downstream consumers of your statistics. They get to know what's done to the data. So you can actually tell them the exact distribution and parameters of the noise you've added. And this allows it to be taken into account for future analyses. So this prevents false conclusions. Traditionally, lots of methods in this sort of area of privacy, which is broadly called statistical disclosure control, have required secret things to be done to the data. And that means that your data has been changed in a way you can't account for in your analysis. So this does introduce a risk of false conclusions. It's also assumption-free, which I think is quite handy. And what I mean specifically by this is that it doesn't assume a particular method of attack on the part of the adversary. So if someone comes up with a different way of doing a reconstruction attack or a slightly different variant, your protection doesn't depend, it's not overfit to a particular attack. It doesn't depend on people using a certain class of attack. So it just limits the amount of information revealed about individuals, and that's the sort of baseline level that prevents all attacks. So it's not liable to break in the future if new attacks are discovered. So wrapping up my talk, I'll end with some recommendations. And my first is to understand the tools you have for the situation you have. So forks are great. They're really handy. I use one every day, as do many of us, I'm sure, but they're horrendous for eating soup. It doesn't mean forks are useless. It means that we have to understand when to use them and how. So firstly, you need to think, do I need to publish this data openly? Because if you don't, you may not want these strong data level controls. You may, in fact, want to rely on environmental controls, so restricting access to your data. You will need to understand the risk of the data. So what could people learn about data subjects? And that's going to affect your choices about what to do with the data. You need to understand the utility of your data. You need to know what you want to get from your analysis, or have a good idea of what a good analysis looks like, to know when you're adding a bit too much noise or not. Really importantly, you need to know whether your analysis is about people or groups. Differential privacy is designed to allow inference about groups of people. You learn things about groups of people without inference about specific individuals. If the goal of your analysis is to learn things about specific individuals, that's at loggerheads with the aim of differential privacy, and you won't be able to do your analysis with differential privacy with any good guarantee. So an example of an analysis about groups of people would be, I don't know if many of you have seen, Google have published movement patterns, aggregated location trends, and they've actually done this with differential privacy, because that's about groups of people. It's not about how specific people are moving, it's about how people are moving in general. It's a great example of an analysis that's really amenable to differential privacy, and huge kudos to them for doing that. But for example, contact tracing is about specific people here. We're looking at interactions of specific people, and that's harder to do, probably not suitable for differential privacy. And in fact, you'd have to turn to other privacy preserving techniques that won't be the subject of this talk. And my final recommendation is, if you are interested in learning about DP, interact with the literature. So it's not the world's simplest thing. It's also not the world's most complex thing once you learn a little bit about it, but it's possible to do wrong. It's possible to set noise wrong, or it's possible to configure your analysis in such a way that you lose that mathematical property. So it's important, if you're going to do it, to engage well with it. There's a big community about this. It's at least a decade old in theory from academia, and we're seeing it applied in the real world more and more these days. And there are now open source toolboxes and things like that available for performing differentially private analyses. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I'd like to say that if you want to learn more, I actually co-authored a report introducing differential privacy and pros and cons in a bit more detail than I can handle in 20 minutes, written for the Government Statistical Service here in the UK. And that was co-authored with Professor Kobi Nassim, who was one of the inventors of differential privacy in the first place. I also recommend, if you're interested in learning more about privacy in general, you can check out my employer at privitar.com and at Privitar Global, or you can tweet me at Hector Page. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Hector, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. Yes, a bit of a slightly, I was contemplating, I thought one of the previous talks, one given by Professor Maple of WMG, was really testing my understanding at points, but this one took it further.
Apologies.
No, I mean, in a good way. I'd love to read that paper. I mean, would it be possible for you to be able to post that on the Ask Me Anything channel?
Yeah, I can send you a link to it. That's available publicly online. It was
great.
it was part of what's called the National Statisticians Quality Review. So it was a review of statistical methods and things for the government statistical service, and that's all publicly available.
Great, great. So I have one question of my own, and then a question from an attendee. So the first is my own question, just to verify, because it wasn't quite clear to me from the talk. So would like the the ONS here in the UK and equivalent agencies elsewhere, are they already using this for survey level data?
So I believe they've looked into it.
Right.
I believe they've looked into it. I think they've done some work on it internally. They are using something else, I think, for now. And that's partly due to the fact that not all data sets are attackable innately, basically. So perhaps you just happen to have a data set where there's nothing sensitive, or you happen to have a data set where a reconstruction attack, based on the amount of information you've released, wouldn't get very close. So as I mentioned about reconstruction, you release more and more information and the attack gets better and better. So right. If you limit the amount of information you release, an attack may not get that close. So what differential privacy is going to do in this situation is allow you to release more information if you want to, with a better guarantee of safety. But if you're not going to do a lot of analysis anyway, and there's a limited amount you can infer from it, then there's no need for differential privacy. So I believe they've probably made a judgment at somewhere in that level that what they're releasing does not warrant that level of protection. There's a very strong mathematical guarantee of protection, so it's not for everything, of course.
Interesting. So I'll ask two questions coming from the floor. The first is, I think you sort of alluded to it one form or another, but does differential privacy work with smaller data sets? Is a question from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, so it's what is the size of a group relative to the size of an individual, right? So I suppose a way of thinking of it is if you add noise enough to hide an individual, if there are very few people in your data set, most of your statistics are going to be about the size of an individual. So the noise is going to obscure those too. So your utility gets worse because the amount of noise to obscure an individual will obscure also statistics in a way. So yeah, bigger data sets where you're looking at larger groups of people are better. You get a better sort of privacy utility trade-off, I suppose.
And we've had one comment from the floor asking if there is a service or interested party to act as a friendly hacker to test if a solution, I guess, a particularly differential privacy solution that you know is watertight.
I think there are services available to do that. It's not something we do.
Yes.
But I think there probably are people you can consult about that, certainly in academia. One of the great things about differential privacy is if you put your mechanisms for achieving it up online, you know, open source is a great method for this because it doesn't affect privacy and you get a sort of public sign off on this. So that may be a possible route.
Mm. This is apparently asked with particular reference to COVID-19 statistics, if you know of anyone there, but yeah, I think there's quite a few services who provide this sort of thing, actually.
Okay.
You know, sort of white hat testing,
from
what I'm aware. Interesting. So, with a sort of startup hat on, in terms of you know, people at a hackathon, are there any particular industries or kind of early stage applications you could see as most likely to want to consider to use differential privacy mechanisms such as the ones that you've outlined?
Interesting.
What would be the use cases and company types that would most benefit from that approach, in your view? As our final question.
So it's going to be organizations that wish to make data publicly available. So when you cannot rely on the environment, so when you want to put things publicly available. So anybody who wants to do that really and is worried about the risk of somebody seeing that data and inferring something about an original data subject in the data set. So anywhere where the data is sensitive and you want to publish an analysis publicly, really it's suitable for a great number of things.
I think that ultimately speaks to one of the key things this hackathon has been all about. So on our call, I was introducing the idea to you last week or the week before. It's all been a bit of a blur. Some point in the very recent past, I was outlining to you that we have the three strands of focus at this hackathon. The citizen science, enabling people to contribute their data to efforts by governments and health authorities to map the spread of the pandemic. Care in the community, which is obviously looking out for vulnerable people, and then mass coordination to mobilize people in education campaigns. I think, you know, particularly in that first one, you know, with organizations seeking to use very large data sets. This is perhaps something that some of the builders can think of, particularly, of course, when combined with certain solutions that might actually minimize the amount of data held elsewhere in organizations in the first place, such as personal data accounts, where the user holds their own individual and is merely inquired by the organization conducting the analysis. But look, there's a hell of a lot to talk about. I note that Professor Maple has joined the call. No doubt has some stuff to say. However, I must sadly affirm that it is the end of this particular session. It's been really interesting to hear you talk through that. If you have time, I'd love to invite you onto the Ask Me Anything Slack channel. Did you get the Slack link, or should I send it over to you?
I've got the email for it. I haven't jumped on the channel, but I will do so.
Fantastic, fantastic. Because I'm sure some of the crowd here will have a few questions for you. And
not,
if you're
not literally anything, by the way, not let's keep it to differential privacy.
Yes, well, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and be in touch again soon.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right, thanks all. I'm now going to stop this recording.